I've always been the kind of person who enjoys a quiet winter night, especially when the snow is falling heavily outside. There's something comforting about the cold and the stillness, the way everything seems muffled under layers of snow. But that night, that snowstorm, it turned something familiar and peaceful into something terrifying. It all started on a Thursday evening. I had just moved into a small cabin in the woods, about an hour outside of town. I wasn't expecting to be stuck out there in the snow, but the forecast had been calling for a blizzard, and I was used to the unpredictability of weather in the mountains. I was alone, just me and my dog Duke, trying to settle in after my recent move. The cabin was cozy enough, with a fireplace to keep the chill out, and I had enough supplies to last through the storm. By the time the snow started falling, it was around 9 p.m. It came down fast. Thick, heavy flakes that were falling so fast, it looked like the world outside had disappeared. I figured the worst of it would pass by morning. But by midnight, the snow was still coming down, and the wind had picked up. Duke, usually calm, was acting a little strange. He kept pacing around the living room, whining and looking toward the windows. I chalked it up to him being nervous about the storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like something was lightly dragging against the window. I sat up in bed, straining my ears in the dark. Duke was sitting up too, staring at the window, ears perked. My heart started to beat faster. I pulled the curtains aside just enough to peek outside, but there was nothing, just snow. Everything was covered in a thick, blinding white. The wind was howling, but there was no sign of any movement. I figured it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong, like I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that I heard it again. Louder this time, scratching, followed by a thud, like something heavy had fallen against the side of the cabin. My blood ran cold. Duke was growling low, his teeth bared. I grabbed the flashlight and tried to calm myself, but every time I shone the light through the window, there was nothing. The storm was blinding outside, but nothing was moving. I must have sat there for almost an hour before I heard the sound again. This time, it was different. It was like something was dragging itself along the ground, just outside the window, scraping against the snow. The noise was slow, deliberate, and unnerving. At that point, I was seriously considering calling for help. But the phone lines were down. The storm had knocked out the power hours ago. I was trapped, alone with whatever was out there. I decided to check the back door, thinking maybe some animal had gotten stuck or was trying to get in. But when I opened it, the snow was piled high, and the wind nearly knocked me off my feet. Duke bolted outside before I could stop him, barking like a maniac. I ran after him, calling his name, but the snowstorm was so thick, I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. My flashlight barely made a dent in the darkness. The wind was screaming in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, just as I thought I was going to lose him, I heard his bark. Only it didn't sound right. It was like a desperate, panicked bark, followed by a silence that seemed far too heavy. I ran toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. Lying in the snow, barely visible in the flickering light, was Duke. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, his body frozen stiff. There were no marks on him, no blood, nothing that would explain what had happened. But there was something worse than the sight of him lying there, something that felt far colder than the snow. I could hear it then, just beyond the trees, something moving, something tall, too tall for a man, stumbling through the thick snow. The figure was obscured by the storm, but I could see enough to know it wasn't natural. It moved in jerky, uneven motions, dragging its limbs like it was struggling to keep itself together. I grabbed Duke, my legs shaking, and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I locked all the windows, double-checking every door, praying the storm would stop, hoping I had imagined everything. But the noise outside didn't stop. I could hear it circling the cabin, scraping, tapping, dragging itself against the walls. It was waiting, watching. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, closer now, pressing up against the walls, trying to get inside. I stayed awake all night, staring out the windows, waiting for dawn, knowing that whatever was out there hadn't left. The snow kept falling, but it never seemed to stop. The storm stretched on for days, longer than any blizzard should. And when it finally cleared, the world outside was still, silent. But there was one thing I knew for sure. The figure was gone. But the storm never really ended. It was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, in the whispers of the wind, in the stillness of the snow. It's been weeks, and I still hear that scratching sometimes. It's faint, but I know it's there, and I know I'm not alone. So if you ever find yourself in the mountains during a snowstorm that lasts longer than it should, be careful, because sometimes the storm doesn't just come from the sky. Sometimes it comes from something far darker, waiting for the right moment to find you. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I'd been planning this trip for months, a few days away from the hustle and bustle, up in a small cabin near Lakewood, a place I'd rented through a booking site. I'd heard it was secluded, which sounded perfect to me. The thought of a quiet weekend surrounded by snow, reading and unwinding, was exactly what I needed. When I arrived, everything seemed fine. The cabin was rustic, charming even. It was perched on the edge of a small forest, the view of the lake in the distance. The air was crisp and cold, but the kind of cold that feels refreshing. The kind you only get when you're far away from city lights, surrounded by nothing but the quiet of nature. I unpacked, lit a fire in the hearth, and settled in for the evening. The snowstorm wasn't supposed to hit until later that night, so I spent the evening enjoying a book and the crackling of the fire. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. But I brushed off the feeling, telling myself I was just overthinking. Around midnight, the storm arrived. The wind started howling outside, and the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind seemed to rattle the walls of the cabin. It wasn't unusual for snowstorms to hit hard in this area, so I wasn't concerned at first. In fact, I found it a bit comforting, like I was tucked away from the rest of the world. But then, something strange happened. At about 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Snow and wind can play tricks on your ears, right? But the footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy to be the wind. They were slow, like someone was walking around the cabin, pausing every few seconds. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it was someone lost in the storm, someone who had wandered off the trail. I tried to reason with myself, but the sound continued, circling the cabin, growing closer to the window. I could hear the crunch of snow under boots, real human footsteps. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:15 a.m. Panic started to creep in. I had a bad feeling. I tried calling the rental company, but no signal. I grabbed the fire poker, just in case. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Something told me I needed to be prepared. Then the footsteps stopped, dead silent. I waited. The only sound now was the howling wind. I tried to steady my breathing, thinking maybe it was just some random person passing by. But then I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the window. I froze. The knock was faint, but it was definitely there. I didn't dare look out the window, but I could feel something out there watching me, waiting. The air felt thick, like something wasn't quite right, like the storm outside had brought something else with it. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the wind and praying that the knock was just my imagination. But then the window creaked. It wasn't just the wind. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone was trying to pry open the window. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff and rushed to the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time right behind me, just outside the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my heart beating in my throat. I spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing but snow and darkness beyond the windows. The door handle started to turn. I bolted. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to break open a window and climb out of the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. The snowstorm was worse than ever, the wind biting at my skin. I ran through the snow, slipping and stumbling, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away from the cabin, away from whatever was out there. I don't know how long I ran. When I finally found my way to a road, I flagged down a car, and the driver took me to the nearest town. I didn't stop to explain what had happened. I just needed to be away from that place. I tried to contact the rental company the next day, but when they finally got back to me, they said they had no record of a cabin near Lakewood. The address I'd stayed at, they'd never rented it out before. I don't know who or what was out there in that storm, but I've never gone back to Lakewood. Every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can still hear those footsteps in the back of my mind, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the faintest knock on my window.